So my name's Steve Wally, and today we're going to talk about patterns for open source project success. And really the thing that was the genesis of this idea is I had a number of discussions with folks that were running projects and very diverse projects almost 15 years ago. And when I say diverse projects, I mean things as different as device drivers for video graphics cards and the SendMail community. And the stories that the leaders of these communities would each tell were that there were orders of magnitude differences in how their participation worked between users and actual contributors. And what they meant by that, and the examples they would give, is for every 1,000 users, you might see 100 people offer up some kind of feedback in the order of a bug report, of which maybe 10 people maybe had, they were developers that were giving you a fix, of which one of those was actually they'd read your programming guidelines and turned it over to you. And that you literally needed thousands of users to get tens of really good contributions. It kind of goes counter to the old complaints that you'd hear from people that, oh my God, I have too many freeloaders in my community. No, freeloaders means you're doing it right. The interesting thing about this, though, is I worked on a project back when I was still at Microsoft 12 years ago now. And the project was called Rotor. It was a shared source project. There is nothing about it that was open source. However, we did our best efforts when we were sharing this body of software out for academic research to ensure that it ran on 3 platforms, and with one script you could set your environment. With a single command you could build all of the software from scratch. So basically unpack the tar archive and type a single build command. And then with one more command you could test it all. And we had very minimal documentation. Essentially it was a couple of screenfuls that told you how to do the one-line build and the one-line test. And now that people were in a known state, we kind of described the way the source tree worked. And 24 hours later, after we published it, we got our first righteous bug fix. And this was somebody who deeply understood that how JIT technologies work for the shared source CLI, and he deeply understood the Intel chipset. And he gave us a 15-line change that gave us a 10% boost in JIT performance. And then 24 hours after that, we got our first righteous bug fix where somebody had noticed something, and they even went to the effort of giving us the test case in our test suite to prove that they'd fixed the bug. So while you might need thousands of users and to get tens of these kind of gems of contribution, there's no telling when you're going to get those. We saw those first 2 things literally within the first couple of days. And so really what we're looking at is this idea of an open source project is a conversation in software around the code with a small group of committers. And ultimately, we want to attract more developers to the project because really what we want is more contribution to the project. And well, to do that, we need more users of our software, because out of that pool of users, we're going to find those developers who are hopefully going to make some contributions. And so one of the first things we need to be doing is expanding that area, expanding our number of users, our user community. And so there's really 3 on-ramps that you need to think about driving. How are you going to increase your user base? So how do you make it easy to install and configure and use the software? And then how are you going to encourage developers? So out of that user base, how are you going to make it easy for a developer, not just to install and use the software, but to actually build and test it to a known state so they can begin to do their own experimentation? And then from there, how do you make it easy to contribute? So for those developers that have been doing interesting experimentation, how do you encourage them? How do you communicate to them to let them know that you are ready for their contributions or to encourage particular contributions. So let's look at each of these questions. Let's start with, how do we increase our user base? Well, there's a number of software construction activities that you can do that really are fundamentally important. So, are your project executables? Obviously, they need to be published. Do you have an automated build environment? Does it install in an automated fashion? Have you made bug tracking available to your users so that they can report bugs that they find? These are software construction activities. I'm afraid I've always been a huge fan of software discipline, software construction disciplines. I am a software engineer. The next thing, though, that you need to do when you're increasing your user base is there's a set of community development activities. Now, these are separate from what you're doing with the software. So, what's the project license? Do you have some basic FAQs and basic how-tos? Are there forums or an email list that you're using to communicate with folks? These are the absolute bare necessities if you're going to start to increase your user base. Now from there, how do you start encouraging developers? How do you get them to begin to do things? Well, you have to make it easy for them to build and test and experiment. No developer wants to enter your community. Even if they found the software useful to use, now they have to sit there and they unpack the tarball or they cloned the Git repository and they don't know what to do. And there's no obvious scripts or there's no obvious documentation. The easier you can make it to build and test to a known state, and at that point they can begin to explore and experiment, that's how you're going to do things. That's how you're going to gain these developers. So again, using some software construction ideas and activities. Is the complete source published? Have you got an automated build? Have you got an automated test? Can a developer unpack your world, clone your world, and get to a known state trivially? And again, on the community development activities. So you might be evolving your community at this point. You've been exploring the idea of having more and more users, but now you're looking for more developers. So have you got a mission statement? Do you have contribution guidelines? Do you have some kind of a communication platform, an IRC channel, a developer's email list rather than a general email list? Do you have a code of conduct? So these are things that are important when you start thinking about how to work with developers around the source code. Now, we still haven't got to contributors yet, but let's talk about them next. How do you make it easy to contribute? So what are you going to communicate to your community? You've made it easy for developers to actually build something in their own world. Now, how do you get them to contribute it? So again, let's go back. Software construction activities. Do you have a basic architecture description? Everybody needs to know how these things hang together, whether it's a description of the tree, the MD file at the top of your Git repository on GitHub. It doesn't really matter, but is there a basic architectural description so that a developer can actually orient themselves? Do you have any kind of serious continuous integration or continuous deployment efforts? You look at something like the way they've organized the OpenStack community, and there's a huge amount of work going on there that makes things extraordinary in their ability to, in real time, check what's being contributed in before they even bring it up for review. And then again, let's talk about community development activities. What kind of governance do you have? Are you big enough that you actually have events where you can genuinely reach out to people and developers can find one another and begin to talk to your core committers and the people that are already contributing? So how do you evolve that? Now, there's a really interesting thing we haven't talked about here. There is a way to grow your community considerably. And it depends a little bit on timing. You need to be in a space where you are evolving your community to the point that companies want to participate. And so you need to do an extra set of things then. How do you make it easy to get commercial contributions into your community? Now this gets difficult because here you need a whole lot of IP management activities. But the benefit is if you get this right, you get dedicated resources contributing into your community. Now, there's a whole lot of activities here that are very different. These are things like, again, how is your license constructed? Do companies feel comfortable with it? Are you managing your contribution flow? Are you managing the IP tracking of that contribution flow? Now, maybe it's as simple as, the Linux DCO, developer certificate of origin kind of thing. Or maybe it's a more heavyweight process that's tracked like the Apache contributor license agreement workflow or the Eclipse contributor license agreement workflow. But you need to be tracking the IP at this level because that's something that companies care about. But the benefit in return to your community is you end up with dedicated contributions because now you've got companies tend to want to use the software in products and services that they're going to offer. The best practice that we have in this area is to create a nonprofit foundation. Now we can have a huge discussion about whether the foundation, this nonprofit, is for the public good or whether it's a trade organization. Under American tax law, you're arguing is it a 501c6 or not for the trade association. But the net of it all, the important part of it all, is you've created a neutral, level playing field so that all commercial contributors understand the IP landscape and nobody feels like they're contributing to somebody else's product per se. Like everybody knows how this gets together. And when you put this all together, there are essentially this large collection of practices, but we know how these practices work. And we've been doing this for a very long time now. You could argue we've been doing this for 25 to 35 years. The Free Software Foundation, as that first IP management foundation, goes all the way back to 1985. But these are the practices we put in place. Essentially, there's three vectors you're following here. It's the community development vector, the software construction maturity vector, and the IP management activities that go with this. And what you're trying to do, again, remember, is build those on-ramps, because what you want to do, ultimately, you want to encourage users, because you need to grow your user base. You need to encourage developers, because the developers are the people that are going to become contributors if you do this right. And then you want to tell those developers how to contribute. You want to encourage contribution. And if you're successful enough with those things and you begin to see the deployments into more and more interesting areas where commercial organizations want to participate, then how do you encourage commercial contribution? Really what it's all about in driving these on-ramps is you want to turn this kind of simple grow your user base, grow your developer base, grow your contributions into a proper ecosystem. And here people are using this software in the middle of services and products. There's support being offered, there's distributions, there's books being written, contractors can be hired, there's training courses, consulting. All of this comes together at that point. Now these are the things that we really have been doing well for a long time, but I hope by thinking along these simple vectors of those three simple questions, encouraging users, encouraging developers, encouraging contributors, and then the special subset of that being encouraging commercial contributors, that you can see that there really is kind of a clean hierarchy to think about how you build the ecosystem. I'm afraid this was a presentation on the web, so I'm not here for questions, but you can always reach out. I'm always happy to answer questions, and thank you very much.